Okay, so this is where we left off at the end of class. I started to go over the 21 demands, but I didn't quite get there. So that's where I'm going to start. So we had already talked about the ending of the Meiji Restoration. We talked about what was going on in terms of why Japan became involved in World War I. Now we're going to talk about the 21 demands that occurred during World War I and what happens after World War I that affects Japan. So the 21 demands essentially were a list of, guess what, demands, okay? So Japan was trying to imperialize China. So the 21 demands are these concessions that they want China to make towards Japan. And there were three primary concessions. Concession number one is that all German interests within China be given to Japan. And remember, that's really the big reason why they entered into World War I in the first place, was so that they could gain any German territory and any German influence that was going on in China would be given over to Japan. So that was the first concession. The second one was the Japanese interest in Manchuria. Remember, that's where the railway was going through. We have that, at the Treaty of Portsmouth, we have Russia and Japan agreeing to this, okay, that they want their interest, Japan wants their interest in Manchuria to be recognized. Essentially what they want is for China to back off. They want to have control in Manchuria, and they want to be able to do whatever they want without any fear of repercussions or action from the Chinese government. The third thing that they want is they actually want Japan to be given a bigger role and a role within the administration, so within the government system and within the policy-making bodies within China. Now, this was something that quite a few people had issues with, and we'll get to those issues in just a second. But that third one is they wanted to have some sort of control within the government system of China. So what happened? Why did they think they could make these particular demands? What we know is going on in China is it's extremely weak. It's weak for two reasons. Reason number one, there's no strong central government, okay? More of a figurehead, but not uniting China as a whole. We have a period of warlordism, essentially where we have different groups, different warlords that reign over certain territory within China. And they all have their own rules, and they all have their own militia, and they all have their own people. So it really creates kind of this disconnect. I was explaining that it's almost like the United States. If the United States had no government, then all the states could do whatever they wanted. But we'd still be part of the United States. It doesn't quite make sense. It really kind of opens us up for vulnerability. And that's what we see happening in China. With that weak central government and with warlordism going on, it makes them vulnerable for Japan to make these demands or for Japan to step in and imperialize. And that's exactly what they do by giving these demands to them. But the interesting thing is the 21 demands really backfires on them. And it backfires for a couple reasons. The first is that they completely underestimate, and when I say they, I mean Japan, completely underestimates Chinese nationalism. So Chinese nationalism is essentially where, even though they have all these warlords, and even though they're kind of a factioned nation as a whole, a country as a whole, they still have national pride. They still have pride in Chinese culture, which means they're not against fighting for what they believe in. And that's something that Japan did not think would happen, okay? And so they actually come together, and we'll talk about a movement that goes on in China that's related to this in just a second. But the second problem is that the United States and Great Britain actually intervene in these 21 demands, and they tell Japan, you cannot have a say in the government of China. They are their own entity. You do not get a seat at their table to help out their government. And so that really kind of creates a rift between what was an okay relationship between the United States and Great Britain and Japan. And it really backfires on them because it rises the suspicions of the United States. Like, why are they doing this? Why are they so imperialistically hungry? Okay. And then it gets even worse. So in 1918, we have the Bolshevik Revolution. The word Bolshevik essentially means communism. Okay. So we have the Bolshevik Revolution within Russia. Now, what ends up happening is the Bolsheviks and the Red Army win, and then we have the creation of the Soviet Union. So this is when Russia becomes the Soviet Union. And then, yes, of course, in 1991, and we'll talk about this a lot later, in 1991, the Soviet Union falls and it becomes Russia, and each of the independent countries that made up the Soviet Union are now independent again. But that's another story for a different day. I'm sorry if I confused you. But in 1918, we have the Bolshevik Revolution. And what starts to happen with the Bolshevik Revolution is the Red Army starts to kind of slowly get a little too close to Southeast Asia and to China for Japan's comfort. So what they decide to do is they actually want to stop the Red Army. They want to prevent the Red Army from taking over, from coming into China. So Japan sends the Imperial Army into Siberia to prevent the Russians, which will later become the Soviet Union, to prevent the Red Army specifically, from coming in anywhere near their interests, okay? And that kind of raises a red flag for the United States. And they're like, you should not be involved in this. You should not be worried about the interests that you don't really have in Russia. And so the U.S. actually sends troops to limit Japanese gains. So they don't want Japan to gain a lot more territory because of this civil war that's going on within Russia, okay? So this is all during World War I, okay? Now, what happens after World War I? That's the big question. So November 1918, an armistice ends World War I. But of course, we know that a cease arms and stop fighting does not mean that it's a treaty. So in 1919, we actually have the Paris Peace Conference. And so all of the entities that fought in World War I come together. And essentially the idea is to come to some sort of agreement. So at the Paris Peace Conference, part of the agreement was that Japan was going to control German colonies within the North Pacific, okay? And one specific section, which is the Shandong province in China, really becomes a question, a formidable question during the Paris Peace Conference. Now, what happens is our president actually kind of faces a difficult decision. Now, during the Paris Peace Conference, China goes through what's known as the May 4th movement. This was the movement that I was just talking about. Essentially, what they say is they are protesting against this conference. And they're protesting because they don't want Japan to control any more of their land. They don't want Japan in the Shandong province. They don't want Japan to control the German colonies in the North Pacific. And so our president, President Wilson, really faces a difficult decision. Does he give this land to Japan and make them happy? Or does he agree with what's going on in terms of China in the fact that through giving this land to Japan, it would lessen China's self-determination? The idea of self-determination means that we as a nation can come together and can make things great within our nation. We can have a stable economy, a stable political system. We are the kind of sailors of our own ship is kind of this idea of self-determination. And the May 4th movement really said, if you give them much more of our land, you're impeding on our self-determination. And that didn't sit well with our president. It didn't sit well with President Wilson. But the problem becomes is if he doesn't give the land in the Shandong province to Japan, he also will not get their signature on the Treaty of Versailles, and he will not get them, and I mean Japan, he will not get Japan to enter into the League of Nations. So he makes the hard decision to give the Shandong province and all control over the German colonies in the North Pacific to Japan. Okay? So he makes that difficult decision because what he has to have is the signature of Japan on the Treaty of Versailles, and he wants them to enter into the League of Nations almost so he can keep a watch on them. So America can kind of say, okay, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, Japan, etc. And this is something that's going to become really important later on down the road when we start talking about World War II and the events leading up to it. So after we have the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and we have the relinquishing of the Shandong province as well as those German-controlled colonies to Japan, we actually see a couple years later, in 1921, the Washington Conference. And in the Washington Conference, there was kind of, by this point, an increase in the disillusionment with Japan. They don't see Japan as a team player anymore. And so at the Washington Conference, a couple decisions are made, and these decisions really, really upset Japan. And we could argue that potentially this was one of the causes that led to the move to global war, or their involvement within World War II. It's definitely a potential possibility, okay? So what happens in the Washington Conference are the following things. Number one, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, so the alliance between Great Britain and Japan, ends. They also decide that they are going to take away the Shandong province from Japan and give it back to China. Remember, that was something they gave them to get them to sign the Treaty of Versailles. So now they're going against their word and what they said they were going to do, okay? The other thing is that they said you must immediately remove all troops from Siberia. And the third hit, or the fourth, I'd probably say this is the fourth hit, was that they imposed a ratio in terms of battleships. So anywhere in the waters outside in the Pacific, so in the Southeast Asia waters, there was a 5-5-3 ratio. So if we were to say, hey, this is the Pacific Ocean, or this is this specific area within the Pacific Ocean, there's now a 5-5-3 ratio, which means 5 ships from Great Britain can be in this location, 5 ships from the U.S. can be in this location, but only 3 ships from the naval forces of Japan can be in this ocean. So really limiting and almost kind of shackling, trying to put them down a peg, right? To kind of say, hey, you don't really have as much power as you think you do, Japan. And so a lot of this created hostilities between the Western world and Japan, kind of going back on what it was that they initially said at the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. In 1922, we also see the Nine Power Treaty. The Nine Power Treaty essentially liquidates existing treaties, okay? So any treaty that was happening before the Nine Power Treaty is liquidated, and it creates an open door policy. Now, this is a big issue, and let me explain why an open door policy would be a big issue for Japan. An open door policy says you cannot impede on any sovereign nation's ability to trade, import, and export. Now, why is that such a big deal? Because China is still technically its own sovereign nation. Even if Japan holds land in China, they don't control the Chinese government, which means that if China has goods and services that they want to import or export to the United States, to the Western world, that Japan doesn't, they can do that freely and make money for their country. So the problem is that Japan is not going to be nearly as lucrative as some of the other countries in Southeast Asia. So the open door policy kind of impedes on what they've already set up in terms of their trade. So if they were trading something specifically out of China, a good that only China makes, and they were receiving the funds to go back to Japan on that particular item, the Nine Power Treaty, which liquidated the existing treaties and allowed for open door, would say you can no longer do that. China is its own entity. If it's in China, if it belongs to China, it's Chinese. It's not your property, Japan, okay? So really kind of creating that next layer of tension between the Western world and Japan. And then in 1930, we have the London Treaty. The London Treaty essentially increased the ratios that were set in the Washington Conference. So those ratios of ships, it increased, and it said you need to disarm. So it led to the disarmament of Japan. It said, you guys have a little bit too much power. You guys are a little too big for your britches. You need to disarm and dismantle your military forces. And what we'll talk about is that that kind of sways the other way and just makes Japan a little bit more power hungry. And so we see some more causes following the London Treaty that really kind of lead down the road to World War II. I hope you guys have a great 3-day weekend, and I will see you all on Tuesday.